The morning bell of Millbrook's one-room schoolhouse rang clear across the dusty main street, its bronze voice carrying over the wooden sidewalks and hitching posts where horses stood patient in the September heat. Clara Whitmore smoothed her navy blue dress and stepped onto the schoolhouse porch, watching as children emerged from various directions like wildflowers blooming after rain. At 31, Clara had found her rhythm in this small Montana town, nestled between rolling hills and distant mountain peaks. Her auburn hair was pinned back in a neat bun, and her green eyes held the particular brightness of someone who had discovered her calling. She had been teaching here for 7 years now, ever since arriving on the westbound train with little more than her mother's Bible, her father's pocket watch, and a determination to make something meaningful of her life. "Good morning, Miss Whitmore," called out young Tommy Patterson, his freckled face beaming as he bounded up the wooden steps. Behind him trailed his younger sister Lucy, clutching a slate board and a piece of chalk worn down to a stub. "Good morning, Tommy, Lucy." Clara's voice carried the warmth she reserved for her students. "I trust you both completed your arithmetic problems?" Tommy's enthusiasm dimmed slightly. "Well, mostly, Miss Whitmore. The long division gave me some trouble." "That's quite all right. We'll work through it together." Clara ushered them inside, breathing in the familiar scent of chalk dust, wood polish, and the faint aroma of the wildflowers Lucy brought each Monday. The schoolhouse was Clara's domain, and she had arranged it with the precision of someone who found comfort in order. 24 wooden desks sat in neat rows, each bearing the initials and small carvings left by students past. A large slate board dominated the front wall, flanked by maps of the United States and Montana Territory. Books lined the shelves she had convinced the town council to build, readers, arithmetic texts, a few volumes of poetry, and her treasured collection of literature that she shared with the older students. By 8 o'clock, all 22 of her students had arrived. They ranged in age from 6-year-old Martha Collins, whose legs barely reached the floor from her desk, to 17-year-old James Morrison, who would likely be her last year before taking over his father's grain business. Clara surveyed them with the satisfaction of a general reviewing well-ordered troops. "Today, we'll begin with penmanship practice," she announced, moving to the blackboard with practiced grace. "The younger students will work on their letters, while the older ones will copy verses from Mr. Emerson." The scratch of pencils on slates filled the air, punctuated by the occasional whispered question or Clara's gentle correction. She moved between the rows, her hand resting briefly on a shoulder here, pointing out a letter formation there. This was her world, predictable, meaningful, safe. During the noon recess, Clara sat on the front steps, eating her simple lunch of bread and cheese, watching her students play in the schoolyard. The boys had organized a game of marbles near the old oak tree, while the girls played with corn-husk dolls in the shade. The September sun painted everything in warm gold, and a gentle breeze carried the scent of approaching autumn. "Miss Whitmore," Lucy Patterson approached with the hesitant step of a child bearing news. "My mama says there's been strange riders in the hills lately. Papa told her not to worry, but she does anyway." Clara set down her lunch and looked at the girl with attention. In a town like Millbrook, news traveled fast, and mothers' worries were often grounded in truth. "What kind of strange riders?" "Lucy. Men who don't come into town proper. They camp up in the foothills and watch through spyglasses." Lucy's young face was serious. "Mama thinks they might be looking for someone." "Well, your papa is a wise man, and Sheriff Daniels keeps good watch over our town," Clara said, though she made a mental note to ask around. "I'm sure it's nothing to worry about." But even as she spoke the reassuring words, Clara felt a small chill that had nothing to do with the changing season. Life in Millbrook was generally peaceful, but the Montana Territory could still be unpredictable. Cattle rustlers, claim jumpers, and men running from their pasts were not uncommon in these parts. The afternoon passed in the usual rhythm of lessons. Clara led the middle students through their geography, pointing out the territories and states on the large map, while the youngest practiced their letters and the oldest worked through problems in their arithmetic books. She found particular joy in watching understanding dawn on a child's face, the moment when letters became words, or when numbers revealed their logical patterns. As the day drew toward closing, Clara assigned the next day's lessons and watched her students file out into the golden afternoon. Most walked home to farms outside town, their voices growing faint as they dispersed along various paths. A few lived in Millbrook proper and lingered to help Clara straighten the classroom. "Thank you, James," she said to young Morrison as he stacked slates on her desk. "How are your preparations for the harvest coming along?" "Good. Miss Whitmore. Pa says this might be our best year yet." James paused, his lanky frame shifting awkwardly. "I wanted to thank you for all the extra reading you've given me, even though I'll be leaving school soon. I plan to keep studying." Clara felt the familiar mixture of pride and loss that came with watching her older students prepare to leave. Learning doesn't end when you leave this schoolhouse, James. It's a lifelong companion. After the last student departed, Clara remained in the quiet classroom, grading papers and preparing the next day's lessons. The late afternoon sun slanted through the windows, casting long shadows across the wooden floor. This was her favorite time of day, peaceful, productive, full of possibilities for tomorrow's learning. She had found contentment in Millbrook, though she was honest enough with herself to acknowledge the loneliness that sometimes crept in during the long evenings. Most women her age were married with children of their own, but Clara had never met a man who understood her dedication to teaching, her need for this work that felt like a calling rather than merely a job. Her parents had died when she was 22, her father of consumption, her mother of heartbreak not 6 months later. Their small farm in Ohio had been sold to pay debts, leaving Clara with little choice but to make her own way. Teaching had been both necessity and salvation, and when the opportunity came to travel west and establish a school in Millbrook, she had seized it with both hands. Now, at 31, she had built a life of purpose and routine. She boarded with the widow Henderson, attended church on Sundays, and participated in the occasional social gathering. But her truest happiness came from this classroom and these children who looked to her for knowledge and guidance. As the church bell chimed 5 o'clock, Clara gathered her papers and prepared to lock up the schoolhouse. Tomorrow would bring another day of learning, another opportunity to shape young minds and perhaps discover something new herself. The future stretched ahead of her, predictable and secure. She had no way of knowing that by this time tomorrow, her carefully ordered world would be shattered, and she would be riding into the wilderness with a man whose very name was whispered with equal parts fear and mystery throughout the territory. The peaceful life she had built in Millbrook was about to end, though whether what followed would be blessing or curse remained to be seen. The setting sun painted the mountains in shades of purple and gold as Clara turned the key in the schoolhouse door, unaware that someone was watching from those distant peaks, and that her fate was already in motion. The following afternoon arrived with an unseasonable chill that made Clara pull her woolen shawl tighter around her shoulders as she conducted the final lesson of the day. The children seemed restless, perhaps sensing the change in weather, and she had to call for attention more than usual as they worked through their reading exercises. "Remember, pronunciation is just as important as comprehension," she reminded them, watching as young Sarah Mitchell struggled with a particularly difficult passage from their reader. "Take your time with each word." It was nearly 4 o'clock when the sound of hoofbeats approached the schoolhouse, not unusual in itself, as parents occasionally came to collect their children. But something about the deliberate, measured pace of this horse made Clara glance toward the window. What she saw made her breath catch in her throat. A man sat astride a massive black stallion, both horse and rider perfectly still as they regarded the schoolhouse. Even from a distance, there was something unsettling about the figure, the way he held himself with absolute stillness, the breadth of his shoulders beneath a dark wool coat, the shadow cast by his wide-brimmed hat that completely obscured his features. Clara had heard enough stories around Millbrook to recognize trouble when she saw it. This was no ordinary traveler, no rancher or merchant passing through town. The very air seemed to thicken with tension as the stranger remained motionless, watching. "Miss Whitmore?" Tommy Patterson's voice broke through her paralysis. "Is something wrong?" "Continue with your reading. Children," she managed, forcing her voice to remain steady. "We have a few minutes left." But her eyes remained fixed on the window, and her heart began to race when the rider finally moved. He dismounted with fluid grace, his movements suggesting both strength and careful control. Even in the fading afternoon light, Clara could see he was tall, well over 6 feet, with the kind of build that spoke of years spent in hard country. The stranger tied his horse to the hitching post with practiced efficiency, then turned toward the schoolhouse. As he stepped into the light, Clara caught her first clear glimpse of his face, and what she saw made her grip the edge of her desk. His features were sharp and weathered, carved by wind and sun into harsh angles that suggested a man who had seen more than his share of hardship. Dark hair showed beneath his hat, and his eyes, even from this distance, seemed to pierce straight through the window to where she stood. But it was not his appearance alone that sent ice through her veins. It was recognition. Elias Boone. The name came to her like a whisper from the wind, carrying with it all the stories she had heard in hushed conversations at the general store, in worried murmurs at church socials. The mountain man who lived somewhere in the high country, who came to town perhaps twice a year for supplies, always alone, always watched with a mixture of fear and fascination by the townspeople. He killed a man back east. She had heard Mrs. Henderson whisper to Mrs. Collins one Sunday after church. Shot him dead in some saloon fight. They say that's why he lives up there like a hermit. I heard it was more than one man. Mrs. Collins had replied, glancing around nervously. And that there's a bounty on his head. Whether the stories were true or merely the kind of legends that grew around solitary men in the territory, Clara had never known. But now, watching Elias Boone approach her schoolhouse with that same unsettling deliberation, she found herself praying they were nothing more than gossip. The heavy wooden door opened without a knock, and suddenly he was inside her sanctuary, filling the doorway with his presence. Up close, he was even more imposing than she had imagined. His coat hung open to reveal a worn leather vest and the unmistakable bulge of a gun at his hip. His boots were scuffed and practical, the kind made for rough country. And his hands, she noticed his hands immediately, were large and scarred, the hands of a man who had fought for everything he possessed. But it was his eyes that held her attention. They were gray, the color of storm clouds, and they fixed on her with an intensity that made her feel exposed, as if he could see straight through to her soul. There was intelligence in those eyes, and something else, something that might have been pain, carefully hidden but not entirely concealed. "Children," Clara heard herself say, though her voice sounded strange and distant to her own ears. "Please continue reading quietly." Behind her, she could hear the rustle of pages and whispered words, but her entire focus was on the man who had invaded her ordered world. He removed his hat, revealing thick dark hair threaded with premature gray, and she noticed that his movements, while controlled, carried a kind of weariness that spoke of long years and hard living. "Miss Whitmore." His voice was deep, roughened by weather and solitude, but surprisingly cultured. It was not the voice she had expected from the stories. "I need to speak with you." "I'm afraid I'm still conducting class. Mr. She let the sentence hang, though they both knew she recognized him. "Boone. Elias Boone." He stepped further into the room, and several of the children turned to stare with wide eyes. "This can't wait." Clara felt a chill that had nothing to do with the weather. "Perhaps you could return when school has ended, in about 15 minutes? "No." The single word carried finality. "You need to come with me. Now." The silence that followed was deafening. Clara could hear her own heartbeat thundering in her ears, could sense the tension radiating from her students. Young James Morrison had gone rigid in his seat, and she could see him calculating whether he could reach the door before this stranger could stop him. "I'm afraid that's quite impossible," Clara said, surprising herself with the steadiness of her voice. "I have responsibilities here." If you have business with me, we can discuss it after. Ma'am. Elias Boone's voice cut through her protest like a blade. I'm not asking. Pack whatever you need. We're leaving. The words hit her like a physical blow. This couldn't be happening. Men like Elias Boone belonged to stories and whispered warnings, not to her real, ordered world of lessons and schedules and predictable days. Sir, I must insist that you leave this schoolhouse immediately, she said, moving to put her desk between them. You're frightening the children. For the first time, his gray eyes shifted to survey the room, taking in the wide-eyed faces of her students. Something flickered across his features. Regret, perhaps, or acknowledgement of the fear he was causing. But when his gaze returned to hers, his resolve appeared unchanged. I'm sorry for that, he said, and she believed he meant it. But this is bigger than their comfort or yours. There are men coming to Millbrook, and they mean you harm. I can't let that happen. Men? What men? I don't understand what you're talking about. Clara's mind raced, trying to make sense of his words. I think there's been some mistake. No mistake. Elias moved closer, and she caught the scent of pine and wood smoke that clung to his clothes. You were at Murphy's saloon 3 nights ago. You heard something you shouldn't have heard. Clara's blood turned to ice. She had indeed been at Murphy's, not for drinking, but to deliver a message from Mrs. Henderson to her nephew who worked there. She had waited near the bar while the young man finished his duties, and there had been men talking at a corner table. Loud, boastful men who had clearly been drinking for some time. One of them, a well-dressed stranger with soft hands and cruel eyes, had been telling stories, ugly stories about a killing back east, about how easy it had been to make it look like someone else's crime. She had tried not to listen, but his voice had carried, and the details he shared had made her stomach turn. I don't know what you think I heard, she began, but Elias cut her off with a shake of his head. You know exactly what you heard, and now Clayton Morse knows you heard it. His jaw tightened. He left town this morning with 3 men. They'll be back tonight or tomorrow, and they'll make sure you can never repeat what you know. The name hit her like a thunderbolt. Clayton Morse, the son of Judge Harrison Morse from back east, she now realized. The man whose drunken boasting had turned her stomach and made her hurry from the saloon as quickly as possible. Miss Whitmore? Lucy Patterson's small voice cut through the tension. Are you all right? Clara looked at her students, her children, and felt her heart break. They were watching this unfold with the kind of confusion and fear that would mark them for years to come. Whatever was happening here, they didn't deserve to witness it. Children, she said softly, I want you all to walk calmly to the door and go straight home. Tell your parents. She paused, unsure what message she could possibly send that would make sense of this moment. Tell them I'll send word soon. But Miss Whitmore, James Morrison started to protest. Go, now, all of you. Her voice carried an authority they had never heard before, and something in her tone made them obey without further question. They filed out in unusual silence, glancing back with worried faces as they left her alone with the mountain man. Clara watched through the window as they scattered toward their homes, carrying word of what they had witnessed to every corner of Millbrook when the last child had disappeared from view. She turned back to face Elias Boone. Whatever you think you're protecting me from, this isn't the way. There are laws, authorities. The authorities? His laugh was bitter. Judge Morse has more influence than half the territorial government. His son could shoot you in the middle of Main Street and walk away clean. His gray eyes held hers with unmistakable sincerity. You have one chance to stay alive, Miss Whitmore, and that's to disappear until I can figure out how to prove what really happened back in Ohio. Ohio. The word confirmed what she had already begun to suspect, that the story Clayton Morse had told in his drunken bragging was about more than just any killing. It was about the crime that had driven Elias Boone into exile, the murder that had made him a wanted man. You're asking me to trust a stranger, she said quietly, a man with a reputation that precedes him. I'm asking you to choose between trusting me and dying tonight when Morse comes back. His voice was steady, matter of fact. Because make no mistake, Miss Whitmore, if you stay here, you won't see another sunrise. Outside, the wind picked up, rattling the windows and sending dead leaves skittering across the schoolyard. Clara looked around her classroom one more time. At the neat rows of desks, the carefully organized books, the geography maps that had helped her students understand their place in the larger world. This room had been her life, her purpose, her safe harbor. Now, a stranger was asking her to leave it all behind on nothing more than his word that danger was coming. But as she met Elias Boone's storm-gray eyes, she saw something there that the stories had never mentioned. Behind the hardness and the obvious capacity for violence, there was something else. Honor, perhaps, or simply the kind of weariness that came from carrying burdens too heavy for one man to bear. 5 minutes, she heard herself say. Let me gather some things. He nodded once, sharp and definitive. 5 minutes, then we ride. As Clara moved to collect her few precious possessions, she couldn't help but wonder if she was making the greatest mistake of her life, or if Elias Boone might be the only thing standing between her and a grave in Millbrook's small cemetery. The choice, it seemed, had already been made. Clara's hands trembled as she packed her few belongings into a worn leather satchel, her mother's Bible, her father's pocket watch, a change of clothes, and the small photograph of her parents that sat on her bedside table at Mrs. Henderson's boarding house. Each item felt weighted with finality, as if she were gathering pieces of a life she might never see again. Elias waited by the door, his presence filling the small schoolhouse like gathering thunder. He had retrieved a second horse from somewhere, a sturdy chestnut mare that stood patiently beside his black stallion. When Clara emerged with her satchel, he studied her with those penetrating gray eyes. "Can you ride?" he asked, his voice betraying no emotion. "Yes." The word came out smaller than she intended. She had learned as a child on her father's farm, though it had been years since she had done more than the occasional Sunday ride with the church group. Without another word, he helped her mount the chestnut mare. His hands were surprisingly gentle as he adjusted the stirrups for her shorter legs. But Clara found herself flinching at his touch. Everything about this situation felt surreal, as if she were trapped in someone else's nightmare. They rode out of Millbrook as the sun began its descent toward the western mountains, painting the sky in shades of copper and gold. Clara turned in her saddle for one last look at the town that had been her home for 7 years. The schoolhouse stood empty and silent, its windows reflecting the dying light. In the distance, she could see people emerging from buildings, drawn by the news her students would already be spreading. Soon, the whole town would know that their schoolteacher had vanished with the mysterious mountain man. Elias set a steady pace toward the foothills, following trails that seemed to exist only in his mind. Clara had expected him to push hard and fast, but he appeared mindful of her inexperience, keeping the horses to a ground-covering walk that ate up the miles without exhausting their mounts. As Millbrook disappeared behind them, Clara fought against the panic rising in her chest. Every rational thought screamed that she was making a terrible mistake, that she should have stayed and faced whatever danger Elias claimed was coming. At least in town, she would have been among friends, people who knew her, people who would try to help. Now she was alone in the wilderness with a man who might be a killer, riding toward an unknown fate in countries she had never seen. The trail began to climb almost immediately, winding through stands of aspen and pine that grew thicker as they gained elevation. The air grew crisp and thin, carrying the sharp scent of evergreen and the distant promise of snow. Clara pulled her shawl tighter, realizing she was woefully unprepared for mountain weather. "Where are we going?" she finally asked, breaking the silence that had stretched between them for over an hour. "Somewhere safe." Elias didn't turn to look at her, his attention focused on the trail ahead. "Somewhere Morse and his men won't think to look." "How do you know they won't follow us?" "They will, but not tonight, and not on these trails in the dark." He guided his horse around a fallen log with practiced ease. "By morning, we'll be deep enough in the high country that they'll need a full day just to find our starting point." Clara studied his profile as he spoke. noting the way his eyes constantly scanned their surroundings, how his body remained alert and ready despite the steady rhythm of their travel. This was a man accustomed to being hunted, she realized. The thought should have terrified her, but instead, it raised uncomfortable questions about the stories she had heard. As twilight deepened, the trail became increasingly treacherous. They were climbing steadily now, following switchbacks that hugged rocky outcroppings and skirted deep ravines. Clara found herself gripping the saddle horn as her mare picked her way carefully over loose stones and exposed roots. "We'll stop soon," Elias said, seeming to sense her growing fatigue. "There's a place ahead where we can rest safely." True to his word, within another half hour, he led them off the main trail onto what appeared to be little more than a deer path. They climbed through a narrow gap between two massive boulders and emerged into a small clearing hidden from below by the natural rock formation. A spring bubbled up from the hillside, creating a small pool before disappearing underground again. "We'll water the horses and rest here for a few hours," Elias said, dismounting with fluid grace. "But we can't risk a fire. Morse's men might see the smoke." Clara slid down from her mare, her legs unsteady after hours in the saddle. She led the horse to the spring, grateful for the sound of running water and the relative shelter of the clearing. When she turned back, she found Elias watching her with an expression she couldn't quite read. "You're holding up better than I expected," he said. "I'm not sure if that's a compliment or an insult." Clara settled on a fallen log, suddenly aware of how exhausted she was. "Most women would be screaming and weeping by now, I suppose. Most people." He began unsaddling his horse with efficient movements. "But then, most people haven't spent 7 years managing a classroom full of children. That takes a different kind of strength." The observation surprised her. "How do you know how long I've been teaching?" "Small towns talk, news travels." He pulled the saddle from his stallion and set it carefully against a tree. "I know you came here from Ohio after your parents died. I know you live at Mrs. Henderson's and attend services at the Methodist Church. I know you've turned down 3 marriage proposals and that you give half your salary to families who can't afford school supplies for their children." Clara stared at him, unsettled by how much he knew about her life. "You've been watching me. I've been watching the town. There's a difference." Elias moved to tend her horse, his hands gentle as he removed the saddle and bridle. "When you spend as much time alone as I do, you notice things, people, their habits, their character. And what do you think you know about my character?" He paused in his work, considering her question with the same careful attention he seemed to give everything. "You're stronger than you know. Stubborn enough to survive what's coming. Smart enough to understand that sometimes the right choice and the safe choice aren't the same thing." Clara felt heat rise in her cheeks, though whether from anger or something else, she couldn't say. "You speak as if you know me, but you're a complete stranger. For all I know, you're exactly what the stories say you are. A killer running from justice. Maybe I am." Elias finished with the horses and turned to face her fully. "Would that change anything? Would you rather be here with a killer who wants to keep you alive, or back in Millbrook with respectable men who want you dead?" The blunt question hung in the air between them. Clara found herself studying his face in the gathering darkness, looking for some sign of the violence she had heard whispered about. But all she saw was weariness and a kind of resigned determination that spoke of a man carrying burdens he couldn't share. "Why?" she asked quietly. "Why risk yourself to help me? What do you gain from this?" Elias was quiet for so long that Clara began to think he wouldn't answer. When he finally spoke, his voice was barely above a whisper. "Because I know what it's like to be blamed for something you didn't do. To have your life destroyed by lies while the real guilty man walks free." His gray eyes met hers in the dim light. "And because sometimes saving someone else is the only way to save yourself." They shared a cold meal of jerky and hardtack from Elias's saddlebags, washing it down with clear spring water that tasted of snow and stone. Clara had expected to feel exposed and vulnerable in the wilderness, but the hidden clearing felt oddly secure, as if the massive rocks that surrounded them were standing guard. as full darkness settled over the mountains. Elias spread his bedroll on one side of the clearing, while Clara made herself as comfortable as possible on her side, using her cloak as a blanket. The September night was cold at this elevation, and she found herself shivering despite her layers. Here, without ceremony, Elias crossed the clearing and draped a thick wool blanket over her. Mountain nights are colder than valley nights. You'll need this. What about you? Clara pulled the blanket gratefully around her shoulders, immediately feeling its warmth. I'm used to it. He returned to his bedroll, but she noticed he positioned himself between her and the trail they had followed into the clearing. Sleep should have been impossible under such circumstances, but exhaustion proved stronger than anxiety. Clara dozed fitfully, waking periodically to the sound of wind in the pines or the distant cry of some night bird. Each time she stirred, she could see Elias's silhouette against the stars, apparently keeping watch through the long hours. Dawn came with a gradual lightening of the sky beyond the rock walls of their shelter. Clara woke to find Elias already moving about the clearing, saddling the horses with the same quiet efficiency he had shown the night before. Her body ached from sleeping on the ground, and her hair had escaped its careful pins to hang in tangled waves around her shoulders. We need to move, Elias said when he saw she was awake. We have a long climb ahead, and I want to be well into the high country before Morse starts looking. Clara rose stiffly, rolling the blanket he had given her and wondering at the courtesy from a man who was supposedly holding her against her will. As she prepared to mount her horse, she caught sight of something that made her pause. Elias was checking his rifle, and in the morning light, she could see that the stock was carved with intricate patterns, not the rough scratches of a bored man, but careful, deliberate artwork that spoke of patience and skill. The contradiction struck her forcefully. This was not the weapon of a mindless killer, but of someone who took pride in craftsmanship, who had the soul of an artist despite his hard exterior. Ready? Elias asked, noticing her scrutiny. Clara nodded, though she felt anything but ready. As they left the hidden clearing and began the steep climb into the true mountains, she found herself studying her captor with growing confusion. Everything about him contradicted the stories she had heard. His courtesy, his consideration for her comfort, the careful way he had watched over her during the night, none of it matched the image of a ruthless fugitive. The trail grew increasingly difficult as they climbed, winding through dense forests of pine and fir that blocked out much of the morning sun. They crossed rushing streams on fallen logs and navigated around massive granite outcroppings that rose like monuments from the forest floor. Clara's respect for Elias's knowledge of this country grew with each mile. Without him, she would have been hopelessly lost within an hour. By midday, they had climbed high enough that patches of snow lingered in the shadowed places, and Clara's breath came in visible puffs. Her hands were numb with cold despite her gloves, and she was grateful when Elias finally called a halt near a small tarn that reflected the surrounding peaks like a mirror. We'll rest here and water the horses, he said, dismounting and immediately moving to help Clara down from her mare. How are you holding up? I'm fine, Clara lied, though her legs nearly buckled when her feet hit the ground. Elias studied her with those penetrating gray eyes. You don't have to pretend to be stronger than you are. This country tests everyone. I said I'm fine, but even as she spoke, Clara swayed slightly, and Elias's hand shot out to steady her. When did you last eat a real meal? He asked. Clara thought back, realizing it had been yesterday's lunch in the schoolhouse, a lifetime ago. It seemed, I'm not hungry. That's the altitude talking. You need to eat. He guided her to a fallen log beside the tarn and began unpacking food from his saddlebags. The air's thinner up here. Takes some getting used to. As Clara ate the simple meal he provided, she found herself watching Elias tend to the horses. His movements were economical and sure, but she noticed the way he spoke softly to the animals, the gentleness in his touch as he checked their hooves and adjusted their gear. It was another piece of evidence that didn't fit the picture of a cold-blooded killer. Mr. Boone, she said suddenly, surprising herself with the words. The man who was killed back in Ohio. Who was he? Elias went very still, his hands freezing on his horse's bridle. For a moment, Clara thought he wouldn't answer. When he finally turned to look at her, his face was carved from stone. His name was Samuel Hartwell. He was a good man, a farmer with a wife and 3 children. His voice was carefully controlled, but Clara could hear the pain beneath the surface. "And I didn't kill him." The simple declaration carried such conviction that Clara felt something shift inside her chest. Whatever else Elias Boone might be, she was beginning to believe he was not a murderer. As they prepared to resume their journey deeper into the mountains, Clara realized that her view of this man and of her situation was changing with each passing hour. The fear was still there, but it was being slowly replaced by something else. Curiosity, perhaps, or the first stirrings of an understanding that nothing about this situation was as simple as it had first appeared. The trail ahead disappeared into a wilderness of stone and sky, and Clara found herself wondering what other revelations waited in the high country where Elias Boone had chosen to make his exile. The cabin appeared at the end of the 3rd day like something from a dream, nestled in a hidden valley so remote that Clara wondered if any other human eyes had ever seen it. They had climbed steadily for hours through increasingly sparse timber until they crested a ridge and descended into this secret hollow, where a sturdy log structure sat beside a clear mountain stream. Clara had expected something crude, a rough shelter befitting an outlaw's hideout. Instead, she found herself staring at a home. The logs were carefully chinked and weathered to a silver gray that blended seamlessly with the surrounding granite. A stone chimney rose from one end, and the roof was covered with split shingles that looked hand-carved. Someone had taken considerable time and care in its construction. "This is where you live?" she asked as Elias helped her down from her horse. "For the past 5 years." He began unsaddling their mounts with practiced efficiency. "Built it myself the first winter after I came to these mountains." Clara approached the cabin slowly, noting details that surprised her at every turn. A small garden plot lay beside the structure, the remnants of summer vegetables still visible despite the early frost. Split firewood was stacked neatly under a covered lean-to, enough to last through the longest winter. Most surprisingly, a small bench sat on the covered porch, positioned to catch the morning sun and offer a view of the entire valley. "It's beautiful," she said, and meant it. Elias paused in his work, following her gaze to take in the scene with eyes that held both pride and something that might have been loneliness. "It serves its purpose." The inside of the cabin revealed even more contradictions to Clara's expectations. The single large room was scrupulously clean and organized, with a stone fireplace dominating one wall and a simple but well-crafted table and chairs occupying the center. Built-in shelves lined another wall, and Clara's breath caught when she saw what filled them. Books. Dozens of books, carefully arranged and obviously well-read. She recognized volumes of Shakespeare, Emerson, and Thoreau alongside practical texts on farming, animal husbandry, and medicine. A small collection of poetry occupied one shelf, and she was surprised to see several works by female authors: George Eliot, Elizabeth Barrett Browning, even Jane Austen. "You read," she said, the words coming out more as an accusation than an observation. "Most evenings." Elias was building up the fire, his movements economical and sure. Winter nights are long in the mountains. Clara moved closer to the shelves, running her fingers along the spine of a worn volume of Walden. "These aren't the books of an uneducated man?" "No, they're not." He didn't elaborate, but Clara caught the tension in his shoulders, as if her observation had touched on something he preferred to keep hidden. She continued her exploration of the cabin, noting the clean dishes stacked on handmade shelves, the simple but comfortable bed in one corner, and the small writing desk positioned near the single window. Everything spoke of a man who valued order and quiet dignity, who had created beauty even in exile. On the desk, she noticed something that made her pause: a piece of wood, perhaps 6 inches long, had been carved into the shape of a bird in flight. The detail was extraordinary. Every feather was carefully rendered, and the creature seemed poised to take wing from its wooden perch. It was the work of someone with both skill and patience, and Clara found herself picking it up to examine it more closely. "That's a hawk," Elias said from behind her, making her jump. "Red-tailed. They nest in the cliffs above the valley." "You carved this?" Clara turned the piece over in her hands, amazed by the craftsmanship. "Helps pass the time." His voice was carefully neutral, but she caught the hint of embarrassment, as if he had been caught in some private moment of vulnerability. "It's remarkable." Clara set the carving carefully back on the desk. "You're an artist." Elias turned away abruptly, busying himself with preparations for the evening meal. "I'm a man who's learned to keep his hands busy, nothing more." But Clara had seen the flush that crossed his weathered features, and she filed away this new piece of information about her enigmatic captor, an educated man who read philosophy and poetry, who carved beautiful things in the long mountain evenings. This was not the picture of Elias Boone that the stories painted. As the days passed in the hidden valley, Clara found herself settling into a routine that felt disturbingly domestic. Elias had insisted she take the bed while he made do with blankets near the fire, and he cooked their simple meals with a competence that spoke of long practice. He was unfailingly courteous, giving her privacy when she needed it and maintaining a respectful distance even in the confined space of the cabin. But it was the small things that began to erode her defenses. The way he quietly mended a torn seam in her dress while she slept, how he always served her first at meals and made sure she had the warmest place by the fire. The morning she woke to find a small bouquet of late wildflowers in a mason jar on the table, mountain asters and Indian paintbrush that he must have walked miles to find. "You didn't need to do that," she said when she found him splitting kindling outside the cabin. "Do what?" But she caught the slight color in his cheeks that told her he knew exactly what she meant. "The flowers. It was thoughtful." Elias set down his axe and straightened, his gray eyes meeting hers with an intensity that made her breath catch. "My mother always said a house without flowers wasn't really a home." It was the first personal detail he had shared about his past, and Clara found herself hungry for more. "What happened to her?" "Died when I was 16. Consumption." His voice was matter-of-fact, but Clara could hear the old grief beneath the surface. "My father followed her 6 months later, said he couldn't bear to live in a world without her music." "She was musical?" "Played piano, sang in the church choir." Elias picked up the axe again, but didn't resume his work. "She used to say that beauty was the only thing that made the hard times bearable." Clara felt something shift in her chest, a loosening of the tight knot of fear and suspicion she had carried since leaving Millbrook. This glimpse of the boy Elias had been, shaped by a mother who valued beauty and music, helped explain the contradictions she had observed. "Is that why you carve?" she asked gently. "Maybe." He hefted the axe, signaling an end to the conversation. "Keeps the hands busy, like I said." But Clara was beginning to understand that nothing about Elias Boone was as simple as he pretended. The turning point came on her 5th day in the valley, when she woke in the pre-dawn darkness burning with fever. Her head pounded, her throat felt raw, and chills racked her body despite the warm blankets. She tried to rise quietly, not wanting to wake Elias, but a wave of dizziness sent her stumbling against the table. In an instant, he was beside her, his hand steady and sure as he guided her back to the bed. "You're burning up," he said, pressing the back of his hand to her forehead. "I'm fine," Clara protested weakly, but even she could hear how unconvincing she sounded. "Like hell you are." The rough language slipped out before he could stop it, and she saw him wince. "Sorry, but you're sick, and mountain fever can be dangerous if it's not treated properly." What followed was a haze of days and nights when fever painted strange dreams behind Clara's closed eyelids. But through it all, she was dimly aware of Elias's presence, his cool hands bathing her forehead with wet cloths, his patient voice encouraging her to drink the bitter herbal teas he brewed, his steady strength supporting her when fever-induced weakness made it impossible to sit up on her own. He never left her alone for more than a few minutes at a time, tending to her needs with a gentleness that seemed at odds with his reputation. When she thrashed in delirium, His low voice read to her from the books on his shelves: Thoreau's Meditations on Nature, Emerson's Essays on Self-Reliance, even passages from Jane Austen that his rumbling baritone rendered strangely soothing. "Why?" she whispered one evening when the fever had broken enough for lucid thought. She found him sitting beside the bed, a book open in his lap, his face drawn with exhaustion. "Why what?" He set the book aside and leaned forward, his gray eyes full of concern. "Why are you taking care of me like this? You could have just left me to recover on my own." Elias was quiet for a long moment, his weathered hands clasped between his knees. When he finally spoke, his voice was barely above a whisper. "I had a wife once, Sarah. She died of fever much like this one. And He paused, swallowing hard. "I wasn't there. I was out hunting. Thought I'd be back in a day or two. When I came home, she was already gone." Clara felt her heart clench at the raw pain in his voice. "I'm sorry?" "It was 3 years before I came to these mountains. I promised myself I'd never again let someone suffer alone if I could prevent it." His eyes met hers, and she saw depths of grief and regret that explained so much about the man he had become. "Especially not someone innocent who's only in danger because of me." The admission hung between them in the firelit cabin, heavy with meaning. Clara understood now why he had risked everything to bring her to safety, why he tended to her with such careful devotion. She was not just a woman he was protecting. She was his chance at redemption for a failure that had haunted him for years. "Tell me about her," Clara said softly. And, to her surprise, he did, as the fire burned low and the mountain wind whispered around the cabin. Elias spoke of Sarah, a farmer's daughter with yellow hair and a laugh like silver bells, who had married him when they were both barely 20 and filled their small house with music and light. He told Clara about their plans for children, for expanding their farm, for growing old together in the Ohio Valley where they had both been born. "She would have liked you," he said as the story wound to its end. "Sarah always said teachers were the most important people in any community, that they shaped the future with every child they touched." Clara felt tears prick her eyes. For Sarah, for Elias, for the life they had planned and lost. "She sounds wonderful." She was. Elias stood and moved to bank the fire for the night. "You should rest now. The fever's broken, but you need to build your strength back up." As Clara settled back into the warm blankets, she found herself looking at Elias with entirely new eyes. The stories she had heard in Millbrook seemed like tales of a different man entirely, or perhaps they were simply the rumors that grew around any man who chose to live outside the boundaries of conventional society. What she saw now was a man shaped by loss and regret, who had built a life of quiet dignity in these remote mountains. A man who carved beautiful things to keep loneliness at bay, who read philosophy by firelight and tended a small garden with the same care he had shown her during her illness. A man who, despite everything she had been taught to believe about him, was beginning to seem less like her captor and more like her protector, as sleep claimed her. Clara's last conscious thought was a troubling one, somewhere in the process of learning to see Elias Boone clearly. She had stopped thinking about escape and started thinking about what it might mean to stay. Clara's recovery was slow but steady, and by the end of her second week in the Hidden Valley, she felt strong enough to explore beyond the immediate confines of the cabin. Elias had been reluctant to let her venture far, but her restlessness finally convinced him to allow short walks along the stream that bordered their sanctuary. It was during one of these solitary walks that she made the discovery that would change everything. She had been following the stream toward a cluster of aspen trees, whose golden leaves caught the afternoon light like coins, when she spotted something unusual wedged between two rocks near the water's edge. At first glance, it appeared to be nothing more than a piece of debris washed down from higher elevations. But something about its regular shape made her look closer. It was a leather portfolio, water-stained and partially buried in silt, but still intact. Clara pulled it free and opened it carefully, her heart stopping when she saw what lay inside. Wanted posters, 6 of them, all bearing the same face, but not the face she expected. The man in the detailed sketches was younger than Elias, with softer features and calculating eyes that held none of the weathered dignity she had come to associate with her protector. The name printed below the image made her blood run cold. Clayton Morse. Wanted for murder in the first degree. Reward: $500. Clara's hands trembled as she examined the documents more closely. The dates were all recent, within the past 6 months, and the locations were scattered across 3 states, but it was the detailed description of the crime that made her sink to her knees beside the stream. Samuel Hartwell. Farmer, age 34, shot dead in his own barn. Witness: Elias Boone, who was found standing over the body with a smoking gun in his hand. But according to these documents, Clayton Morse had been positively identified as the true killer by 2 other witnesses who had come forward months after Elias had fled. A shopkeeper who had seen Morse leaving the Hartwell farm at the estimated time of death. A saloon keeper who remembered Morse bragging about framing some poor farm boy for his crime. Clara read through each poster twice, her mind reeling with the implications. Elias had been telling the truth. He was innocent of the murder that had driven him into exile. And Clayton Morse, the man whose drunken confession she had overheard in Murphy's saloon, was the real killer. But how had these wanted posters come to be here, in this remote valley? And why hadn't Elias shown them to her? She was still pondering these questions when she heard his voice calling her name from the direction of the cabin. Clara quickly rolled the posters back into the portfolio and tucked it inside her shawl before making her way back along the stream. "I was beginning to worry," Elias said as she approached the cabin. His gray eyes searched her face with the careful attention she had come to expect. "You were gone longer than usual. I lost track of time," Clara replied, hoping her voice sounded steadier than she felt. "The aspens are beautiful this time of year." That evening, as they sat by the fire after their simple dinner, Clara found herself studying Elias with new eyes. The knowledge of his innocence should have brought relief, but instead, it raised troubling questions about why he had chosen to remain silent about the evidence that could clear his name. "Elias," she said finally, setting down her cup of coffee, "there's something I need to ask you." He looked up from the piece of wood he had been carving, his hands going still. "What is it?" Clara pulled the leather portfolio from where she had hidden it beneath her chair. "I found this down by the stream today." The color drained from Elias's face as he recognized the portfolio. For a long moment, he simply stared at it, his jaw working as if he were fighting some internal battle. "You weren't supposed to see those," he said finally. "But I have seen them." Clara spread the wanted posters on the table between them, watching as he flinched away from the images of Clayton Morse. "These prove you're innocent. They prove that Morse is the real killer." "Why didn't you tell me?" Elias set down his carving and leaned back in his chair, his shoulders sagging as if a great weight had settled on them. "Because knowing the truth and proving it are 2 different things." "What do you mean? These are official documents. They're worthless?" The bitterness in his voice cut through her protest. "Do you think I haven't tried to use them? I've sent copies to 3 different sheriffs, 2 federal marshals, and a territorial judge. Every one of them told me the same thing. The witnesses have disappeared. The evidence has been lost, and Judge Harrison Morse's influence reaches farther than I ever imagined." Clara felt her heart sink. But surely someone in authority would listen. "To a fugitive hiding in the mountains?" Elias laughed, but there was no humor in the sound. "Clara, you don't understand how this works. The Morse family has money, power, connections that reach all the way to Washington. Clayton could shoot a man in broad daylight on the steps of the territorial capital, and his father would find a way to make it disappear. Then why keep these posters? Why not just—" Clara gestured helplessly. "Why not give up?" Elias was quiet for a long time, his gaze fixed on the fire that crackled in the stone hearth. When he finally spoke, his voice was barely above a whisper. "Because Sarah used to say that the truth has a weight to it, that even when it seems buried beyond recovery, it finds a way to surface." His gray eyes met hers across the table. "I kept hoping that someday, somehow, these papers would matter, that there would be someone willing to stand up and say that justice means more than money and influence. Clara felt something shift inside her chest, a recognition of the burden Elias had been carrying alone in these mountains. He had not just lost his freedom and his home, he had lost his faith in the very system that was supposed to protect the innocent. "The night at Murphy's saloon," she said slowly. "When I heard Morse bragging about the murder, that's why you came for me. You realized I might be the witness you needed." "Yes." Elias met her gaze steadily. "But also because I couldn't let him kill you to protect his secret. I've lost too many people to stand by and watch another innocent person die." The weight of his words settled between them like a physical presence. Clara understood now that her value to Elias was not just as a potential witness, but as a symbol of redemption, a chance to save someone when he had failed to save those who mattered most to him. "What happens now?" she asked. "Now?" Elias gathered up the wanted posters with careful hands. "Now we wait for winter to pass. Come spring, maybe we can figure out a way to get you safely back to your life. And you, what about clearing your name?" His smile was sad and resigned. "Some stains don't wash out. Clara, some mistakes follow you until the day you die." But Clara was no longer content to accept such a fatalistic view. As she watched Elias carefully return the posters to their portfolio, an idea began to form in her mind. Dangerous, perhaps, but not impossible. "There might be another way," she said carefully. Elias looked up sharply. "What do you mean?" "You said the witnesses had disappeared, but what if there was a new witness? Someone who heard Morse confess to the crime himself?" "Clara, no!" Elias's voice was sharp with alarm. "Whatever you're thinking, put it out of your mind. I won't let you risk your life for my vindication. It's not just about you anymore," Clara said, surprising herself with the conviction in her voice. "It's about justice, about making sure that Clayton Morse can't hurt anyone else the way he hurt Samuel Hartwell, the way he would have hurt me if you hadn't intervened." She leaned forward, her green eyes blazing with newfound determination. "I heard him confess, Elias. With my own ears, I heard him describe in detail how he killed that poor farmer and framed you for the crime. That makes me the one witness he can't buy off or intimidate into silence. It also makes you the one person he'll stop at nothing to eliminate." Elias countered. "Clara, you don't understand what you're suggesting. Going up against the Morse family isn't just dangerous. It's suicide. Maybe. Or maybe it's the only way to ensure that neither of us has to spend the rest of our lives running from the truth." Clara stood and moved to the window, gazing out at the star-filled sky above the hidden valley. When she spoke again, her voice was steady and resolved. "I've spent my entire adult life teaching children that doing the right thing isn't always the same as doing the safe thing, that sometimes standing up for what's just requires courage that goes beyond our own comfort." She turned back to face him. "How can I ask my students to live by those principles if I'm not willing to do so myself?" Elias stared at her for a long moment, his weathered face reflecting a dozen different emotions. Finally, he shook his head in what might have been admiration or despair. "You're talking about going back down to civilization, about facing Morse in court, if we can even get that far. Do you have any idea what that would mean?" "I know it would be dangerous. I know there are no guarantees." Clara returned to her chair, leaning forward to meet his gaze directly. "But I also know that I can't live with myself if I don't try. And I don't think you can either, despite what you say about accepting your fate." The silence that followed was charged with possibility and fear in equal measure. Clara could see the war being fought behind Elias's gray eyes, his desire for vindication battling against his need to protect her from the consequences of such a dangerous gamble. "Even if we could make it to Denver without being caught," he said finally, "even if we could find a judge willing to hear the case, Morse's family would move heaven and earth to discredit your testimony. They'd destroy your reputation, question your character, suggest that you're nothing more than a woman whose judgment has been compromised by—" He gestured vaguely between them. "By what?" Clara challenged. Elias's cheeks darkened slightly. by spending months alone in the wilderness with a wanted man, by developing feelings that might cloud your objectivity. The words hung in the air between them, heavy with implications that neither had been willing to acknowledge. Clara felt her heart begin to race, not just from the suggestion itself, but from the way Elias's eyes refused to meet hers as he spoke. "And would they be wrong?" she asked quietly. "About the feelings, I mean—" When Elias finally looked at her, Clara saw her own confusion and growing attachment reflected in his gaze. The man she had feared as a dangerous stranger had become something else entirely: protector, companion, and perhaps something even more dangerous to her carefully ordered heart. "That," Elias said softly, "is a question that might be better left unanswered, at least until we decide what we're willing to risk for the chance of justice." As the fire burned low and the mountain night deepened around their hidden sanctuary, Clara realized that the choice they faced was about more than just clearing Elias's name. It was about what kind of people they wanted to be, and what kind of future they might dare to build together, if they survived long enough to try. The first snow came early that year, blanketing the hidden valley in pristine white that transformed their sanctuary into something from a fairy tale. Clara woke to find the world outside the cabin windows utterly changed, the familiar landscape rendered alien and beautiful by the overnight transformation. "We're snowed in until spring now," Elias said matter-of-factly as he built up the fire. "The passes will be closed for at least 4 months, maybe 5. Clara should have felt trapped, but instead she experienced an unexpected sense of relief. The decision about whether to pursue justice against Clayton Morse had been taken out of their hands, at least temporarily. Winter would give them time to plan, to prepare, and perhaps most importantly, to understand what had grown between them in the long weeks since leaving Millbrook. The rhythm of their days settled into something deeper than mere survival. They rose with the pale mountain dawn, sharing coffee and simple breakfast while the valley gradually emerged from shadow. Clara had taken over much of the cooking, finding unexpected satisfaction in creating meals from their limited supplies. Elias tended to the horses and maintained their equipment, but he also began teaching Clara skills she had never imagined needing. "In country like this, everyone needs to know how to handle a rifle," he said one crisp morning, showing her how to hold the weapon properly. "I hope you'll never need it, but hope isn't much good if trouble finds us." Clara had initially recoiled from the idea of handling firearms, but Elias's patient instruction gradually wore down her resistance. His hands were gentle as he corrected her stance, his voice calm as he explained the mechanics of loading and firing. She discovered that she had a natural aptitude for marksmanship, something that surprised them both. "Your father never taught you to shoot?" Elias asked after she had hit 3 targets in a row. "Papa believed in education over weaponry," Clara replied, lowering the rifle. "He said books were the only weapons a civilized person needed." "Books are powerful," Elias agreed. "But sometimes a person needs more immediate protection than knowledge can provide." In return, Clara began teaching Elias about the law. She had brought little with her from Millbrook, but among her few possessions was a book on territorial jurisprudence that she had acquired years earlier when considering whether to pursue legal studies. Now, by the light of the fire, she guided him through the complexities of evidence, testimony, and courtroom procedure. "The prosecution will need to establish motive, means, and opportunity," she explained one evening, her finger tracing the relevant passages. "We have evidence of means and opportunity from those wanted posters, but motive might be harder to prove." Elias listened intently, his quick mind grasping concepts that would have challenged many formally educated men. "What about my testimony? Can I testify on my own behalf?" "Yes, but it won't carry as much weight as an independent witness." Clara looked up from the book to meet his gaze. "That's why my testimony is so crucial. I'm a disinterested party. At least, that's what we need the court to believe." The irony of that last statement wasn't lost on either of them. With each passing day, Clara found herself anything but disinterested in Elias Boone's fate. She had begun to look forward to their evening conversations with an eagerness that would have alarmed her old self. She found herself studying his profile as he carved by firelight, admiring the sure movements of his hands and the concentration that furrowed his brow. December brought storms that sometimes lasted for days, trapping them inside the cabin while wind howled through the valley and snow piled against the walls. During these forced periods of closeness, they began to share stories of their past lives with increasing openness. Clara told him about her childhood in Ohio, about parents who had valued learning above all else and who had encouraged her unconventional ambition to become a teacher. She described the small farm where she had grown up, the one-room school where she had first discovered her love of education, and the dreams she had harbored of someday establishing a real academy for young women. "You could still do that," Elias said one evening as they listened to the wind rage outside. "After this is over, you could go anywhere, start fresh." "Could I?" Clara looked up from the sock she was mending. One of his, she realized with a start. When had such domestic intimacy become natural? Would any community trust a woman who had spent months alone with a wanted man? Would parents send their daughters to be educated by someone with such a questionable past? Elias's jaw tightened. "I never should have brought you into this. Your reputation, your career. You saved my life," Clara interrupted firmly. "Whatever the cost, I'm alive because of your actions. That's worth more than any reputation." Their conversations ranged across subjects Clara had never discussed with anyone: philosophy, literature, the nature of justice and redemption. She discovered that Elias had educated himself far beyond what his humble origins might have suggested, driven by an intellectual curiosity that had sustained him through long years of solitude. "Sarah used to tease me about my reading," he admitted one night as they sat before the fire. "She said I collected books the way other men collected horses, always looking for the next one that might teach me something new." "She sounds like a wise woman." "She was." Elias stared into the flames, his expression distant. "But she also understood that some hungers can't be satisfied. The need to understand, to learn, to grow. It doesn't end just because you found love." Clara felt something flutter in her chest at his words. "No, I suppose it doesn't." January brought a terrible blizzard that lasted nearly a week, confining them to the cabin's single room with no relief from each other's company. Clara had expected the forced intimacy to be awkward, perhaps even unbearable, but instead she found herself marveling at how naturally they had learned to share the space. They moved around each other with an unconscious choreography, Clara preparing meals while Elias tended the fire, both of them reading in comfortable silence during the long afternoons. When the wind was particularly fierce, they would sit close together on the small sofa Elias had built, sharing warmth and finding comfort in simple proximity. It was during one of these storms that Clara made a discovery that changed her understanding of Elias yet again. She had been searching for another book to read when she noticed something tucked behind the volumes of poetry on his shelf. A small journal bound in worn leather. "What's this?" she asked, pulling it free. Elias looked up from his carving, and she saw his face go pale. "That's private." But Clara had already opened the journal, and what she saw inside made her breath catch. Page after page was filled with Elias's careful handwriting, but these weren't the rough notes of an uneducated man. These were poems, thoughtful, lyrical verses that captured the beauty and loneliness of his mountain exile with startling eloquence. "You write poetry," she said, not quite able to keep the wonder from her voice. "It's nothing." Elias reached for the journal, but Clara held it away from him. "This isn't nothing. This is beautiful." She read a few lines aloud, her voice soft with admiration. "The hawks circle overhead like prayers, made manifest in wind and feather, seeking answers in the endless sky that earthbound souls can never reach." Elias's cheeks darkened with embarrassment. "Clara, please, why are you ashamed of this? This is a gift. Elias, a rare and precious gift." She continued reading, finding verses that spoke of loss and hope, of the harsh beauty of winter mountains and the eternal human need for connection. The man revealed in these pages was sensitive, articulate, deeply thoughtful, nothing like the dangerous fugitive of popular imagination. Sarah encouraged my writing, Elias said finally, accepting that Clara wasn't going to return the journal without a fight. After she died, I thought I'd lost that part of myself. But up here, in the silence, the words started coming back. Clara turned to a more recent entry, one dated just a few weeks earlier. Her heart skipped as she read verses that were clearly about her, about autumn hair that caught firelight like burnished copper, about green eyes that held the wisdom of deep forests, about a teacher who had brought learning and laughter back into his solitary world. "Elias," she whispered, looking up to find him watching her with an expression that made her pulse race. "I know," he said quietly. "I know it's impossible. I know that when this is over, you'll go back to your life and I'll go back to mine, but I couldn't help—" He gestured helplessly at the journal. "I couldn't help writing what I felt." Clara set the journal aside and moved closer to him on the sofa, her heart hammering against her ribs. "What if I don't want to go back to my old life?" "Clara, you don't know what you're saying." "Don't I?" She reached out to touch his face, feeling the roughness of his beard beneath her palm. "I'm 31 years old. Elias, I've had plenty of time to understand my own heart. And my heart is telling me that what I've found here, with you, is worth more than all the respectability and security I left behind in Millbrook." For a moment, she thought he might pull away, might retreat behind the walls he had built to protect himself from further loss. But then his hand came up to cover hers, and she saw in his gray eyes a reflection of her own desperate hope. "If we do this," he said softly, "if we try to build something together, there's no guarantee we'll survive what's coming. Morse and his family won't give up easily." "I know." Clara moved closer still, until she could feel the warmth radiating from his body. "But I also know that I'd rather face whatever comes with you than spend the rest of my life wondering what might have been." When Elias kissed her, it was with a tenderness that belied his reputation for violence. His lips were gentle against hers, seeking rather than demanding, asking permission even as passion flared between them. Clara answered with a fervor that surprised them both, her arms winding around his neck as she pressed closer to his warmth. They held each other as the storm raged outside, and Clara understood that they had crossed a line from which there could be no retreat. Whatever the future held, whatever dangers awaited them beyond the sanctuary of this hidden valley, they would face them together. "Come spring," Elias murmured against her hair. "We'll go to Denver. We'll find a way to make this right." "Promise me something," Clara said, pulling back to meet his gaze. "Whatever happens in that courtroom, whatever they say about us or try to do to us, promise me you won't regret this winter we've had together." Elias cupped her face in his hands, his thumbs tracing the line of her cheekbones with infinite gentleness. "Clara Whitmore, this winter has been the first time I've felt truly alive since Sarah died. Whatever comes next, I could never regret that." As February melted into March and the snow began to recede from the lower elevations, Clara and Elias spent their remaining time preparing for the battle ahead. They rehearsed her testimony until she could recite every detail of that night in Murphy's saloon without hesitation. They studied territorial law until they understood exactly what evidence would be needed to clear his name. But mostly, they cherished the time they had left in their hidden sanctuary, knowing that once they descended from the mountains, their fate would be in the hands of others. The day they spotted the first green shoots pushing through the melting snow, Clara felt her heart clench with equal parts anticipation and dread. Spring meant freedom to leave their valley prison, but it also meant stepping into a world where their love would be tested by forces beyond their control. "Ready?" Elias asked as they stood together on the cabin porch, looking out at the valley that had sheltered their growing love through the long winter months. Clara took his hand, intertwining their fingers with a certainty that surprised her. "Ready." They would ride out tomorrow, carrying with them the evidence that might clear Elias's name and the love that had transformed them both. The outcome was uncertain. The danger's real and immediate, but for the first time since leaving Millbrook, Clara felt truly hopeful about the future. The territorial courthouse in Denver rose from the dusty streets like a monument to civilization's reach into the wild frontier. Built of red brick and crowned with a copper dome that gleamed in the spring sunshine, it represented everything that Clara had once believed in: order, justice, the rule of law over the chaos of personal vengeance. Now, standing on its steps with Elias beside her, she wondered if those beliefs had been naive. Their journey from the hidden valley had taken 2 weeks of careful travel, avoiding main roads and staying clear of towns where Elias might be recognized. They had camped in remote areas and lived on dried provisions, pushing steadily eastward until Denver's sprawl finally appeared on the horizon. The first challenge had been finding a lawyer willing to take Elias's case. 3 prominent attorneys had refused outright when they learned they would be going up against the Morse family's influence. A 4th had quoted a fee that was clearly designed to discourage them. It was only through the intervention of a young idealistic lawyer named Thomas Brennan that they had found representation at all. "I won't lie to you," Brennan had said during their first meeting in his modest office. "This case is going to be an uphill battle. Judge Harrison Morse has friends throughout the territorial government, and his son Clayton has already retained the best legal counsel money can buy. But if what you're telling me is true, then justice demands we try." The preliminary hearing had been scheduled for a Tuesday morning in late May, giving them barely a week to prepare their case. Clara spent long hours with Brennan, going over her testimony again and again until every detail of that night in Murphy's saloon was carved into her memory with perfect clarity. "They're going to attack your credibility," Brennan warned her. "They'll suggest that your relationship with Mr. Boone has compromised your judgment, that you're either lying to protect him or deluded by romantic attachment." "And what do we say to that?" Clara asked. "We stick to the facts. You heard Clayton Morse confess to murder. Everything else is irrelevant to the substance of your testimony." But Clara knew it wouldn't be that simple. Nothing about this case was simple. The morning of the hearing arrived gray and threatening, with storm clouds gathering over the mountains to the west. Clara dressed carefully in her most conservative dress, navy blue wool with minimal ornamentation, and pinned her hair back in the severe style she had once worn in the schoolhouse. If they were going to question her respectability, she would give them as little ammunition as possible. Elias had been staying in a boarding house across town, unwilling to compromise Clara's reputation further by being seen in her company. But as she climbed the courthouse steps, she spotted him waiting near the entrance, and her heart clenched at how isolated he looked among the bustling crowd of lawyers and court officials. He had shaved and worn his best clothes, a dark suit that had seen better days but was clean and pressed. Someone who didn't know his story might have taken him for a rancher or small businessman, respectable if not prosperous. But Clara could see the tension in his shoulders, the way his eyes constantly scanned the crowd for potential threats. "Miss Whitmore." He tipped his hat as she approached, maintaining the formal distance they had agreed upon in public. "Mr. Boone." She nodded politely, fighting the urge to take his hand. "Are you ready?" "As ready as a man can be for his own trial." Inside the courthouse, the preliminary hearing was being held in a smaller chamber than the main courtroom, but it was packed nonetheless. Word had spread quickly through Denver about the case that would pit a schoolteacher's testimony against one of the territory's most powerful families. Clayton Morse sat at the defendant's table with his team of lawyers, and Clara felt her stomach clench when she got her first clear look at him since that night in Murphy's saloon. He was younger than she remembered, perhaps 28 or 30, with the soft look of a man who had never known real hardship. His clothes were expensive, his manner confident, and when his gaze met hers across the courtroom, she saw no trace of remorse or concern. Judge William Hartley presided over the hearing, a stern man in his 60s with silver hair and shrewd eyes that missed little. Clara had been relieved to learn that he had no known connections to the Morse family, though Brennan had warned her that influence could take many forms. "The territory calls Miss Clara Whitmore to testify." Brennan announced when the judge called for the prosecution's first witness. Clara rose on unsteady legs and made her way to the witness stand, acutely aware of every eye in the courtroom following her movement. As she placed her hand on the Bible and swore to tell the truth, she caught sight of Elias sitting in the gallery, his gray eyes steady and encouraging. Brennan's questioning began simply, establishing her identity and background for the court. Clara answered clearly and calmly, drawing on years of classroom experience to project confidence she didn't entirely feel. "Miss Whitmore, can you tell the court about the events of September 15th at Murphy's Saloon in Millbrook? I was there to deliver a message from Mrs. Henderson to her nephew, who worked at the establishment. While I waited for him to finish his duties, I overheard a conversation at a corner table. And who was involved in this conversation? 3 men were seated at the table, but only one was doing most of the talking. I later learned his name was Clayton Morse." A murmur ran through the courtroom at the direct accusation. Clara kept her eyes fixed on Brennan, refusing to look toward the defendant's table. "What did you hear Mr. Morse say?" Clara took a deep breath, knowing that everything hinged on her next words. "He was bragging about a killing he had committed back east. He described in detail how he had shot a farmer named Samuel Hartwell in his own barn, then framed another man for the crime." "Did he mention this other man by name?" "Yes. He called him Elias Boone and laughed about how easy it had been to make it look like Mr. Boone was the killer." The courtroom erupted in whispers and gasps. Judge Hartley banged his gavel for order while Clayton Morse leaned over to whisper urgently to his lawyers. Brennan continued his questioning, drawing out every detail of that night, how drunk Morse had been, how boastful, how specific his confession had been. Clara answered each question steadily, her voice growing stronger as she spoke. "Miss Whitmore, why didn't you report what you heard to the authorities immediately?" "I was frightened," Clara admitted. Mr. Morse was describing a brutal murder with no apparent remorse. I was afraid of what he might do if he learned I had overheard him. "And yet you're willing to testify here today. What changed?" Clara allowed herself one quick glance at Elias before answering. "I realized that staying silent would make me complicit in a terrible injustice. An innocent man has spent 5 years in exile for a crime he didn't commit, while the real killer walks free. I couldn't live with myself if I didn't speak the truth." When Brennan finished his questioning, the lead defense attorney, a polished man named Marcus Worthington, rose for cross-examination. Clara braced herself, knowing this would be the real test. "Miss Whitmore, isn't it true that you disappeared from Millbrook on the very day after this alleged conversation took place?" "I left Millbrook, yes. Under what circumstances?" Clara chose her words carefully. "Mr. Boone came to me and warned that I was in danger because of what I had overheard. He offered to take me somewhere safe. So, you voluntarily left your home, your job, your entire life to go into hiding with a wanted fugitive?" "I left to preserve my life, which Mr. Boone believed was in immediate danger." Worthington paced in front of the witness stand like a predator circling prey. "Miss Whitmore, where exactly did you spend the months between September and May?" "In the mountains, at Mr. Boone's cabin. Alone with him for 8 months. Clara felt heat rise in her cheeks but kept her voice steady. "Yes. And during this time, did you and Mr. Boone develop an intimate relationship?" The question hung in the air like a weapon. Clara was aware of the absolute silence in the courtroom, of Elias's tense posture in the gallery, of Judge Hartley's penetrating stare. "Mr. Boone and I came to care for each other." "Yes," she said finally. "Care for each other." Worthington's tone dripped with insinuation. "Miss Whitmore, isn't it true that you're in love with the defendant and would say anything to clear his name?" "My feelings for Mr. Boone don't change what I heard that night in Murphy's Saloon." Clara replied firmly. "Clayton Morse confessed to murder. That's the truth, regardless of my personal circumstances." Worthington pressed on, trying to shake her testimony, questioning her memory, her sobriety that night, her motives for coming forward. But Clara held firm, drawing on the months of preparation and her own unshakable certainty about what she had witnessed. "Miss Whitmore," Worthington said finally, "isn't it convenient that the only person who can corroborate Mr. Boone's innocence happens to be a woman who has spent 8 months alone with him in the wilderness?" Before Clara could answer, Brennan was on his feet. "Objection, Your Honor. Counsel is arguing rather than questioning." Sustained. Judge Hartley ruled, "Mr. Worthington, do you have any further questions for this witness?" "No further questions, Your Honor." Clara left the witness stand feeling drained but hopeful. She had told her story clearly and completely, and despite Worthington's aggressive cross-examination, she believed she had been credible. The defense called several character witnesses for Clayton Morse, prominent Denver businessmen who testified to his good reputation and civic contributions. But when Morse himself took the stand, Clara watched his composure begin to crack under Brennan's methodical questioning. "Mr. Morse, have you ever been to Millbrook, Montana?" "I may have passed through. I travel frequently on business." "Were you there on September 15th of last year?" "I don't recall specifically." Brennan produced hotel records showing that Morse had indeed been registered at Millbrook's only hotel on that date. He presented evidence of Morse's drinking habits, his tendency toward boastfulness when intoxicated, his presence in several other towns where similar crimes had occurred. Most damaging of all were the wanted posters that Elias had kept hidden for so long. When Brennan introduced them as evidence, showing that multiple witnesses in 3 states had identified Morse as a killer, the courtroom buzzed with excitement. "These are obvious forgeries," Worthington protested. But Judge Hartley examined the documents carefully and ruled them admissible. Under increasingly aggressive questioning, Morse's carefully constructed facade began to crumble. His answers became evasive, then contradictory. When Brennan pressed him about specific details from Clara's testimony, Morse grew angry and defensive. "That woman is lying," he finally exploded. "She's been corrupted by months of immoral living with that criminal. You can't trust the word of a fallen woman." "Your Honor," Brennan said calmly, "I ask that the defendant's outburst be stricken from the record." But it was too late. The damage was done, not to Clara, but to Morse himself. His loss of control had revealed the ugly character beneath his polished exterior. And Clara could see the effect on Judge Hartley's expression. When closing arguments concluded, the judge retired to consider his decision. Clara found herself in the courthouse hallway with Elias, both of them too nervous to speak. Finally, after what felt like hours, they were called back inside. After careful consideration of the evidence presented, Judge Hartley announced, "This court finds sufficient cause to dismiss all charges against Elias Boone and to issue a warrant for the arrest of Clayton Morse on charges of murder in the 1st degree." The courtroom erupted in chaos. Clara felt her knees go weak with relief. And suddenly, Elias was beside her, his strong arms catching her as she swayed. "It's over," he whispered against her hair. "It's finally over." But even as they held each other in that moment of triumph, Clara knew their real challenges were just beginning. They had won their battle for justice, but now they had to figure out how to build a life together in a world that would never fully accept their unconventional love story. In the corridor outside the courtroom, as reporters shouted questions and well-wishers offered congratulations, Elias took Clara's hand and dropped to one knee. "Clara Whitmore," he said, his voice carrying clearly over the crowd. "Will you marry me?" Through her tears of joy and relief, Clara could only nod. But as Elias slipped a simple gold band onto her finger, one he had carved himself during their long winter together, she managed to whisper the word that would seal their fate. Yes. The wedding took place 3 weeks later in the same small Denver church where Clara had prayed for strength during the long days of the trial. It was a simple ceremony, attended by the few friends they had made in the city, Thomas Brennan and his wife, the boarding house keeper who had shown Clara kindness during her stay, and a handful of others who had been moved by their story. Clara wore a dress of cream-colored silk that she had purchased with money from the reward offered for Clayton Morse's capture. It wasn't the elaborate gown she might have dreamed of as a young girl, But as she walked down the aisle toward Elias, she felt more beautiful than any bride in the finest cathedral. Elias stood waiting for her at the altar in a new black suit, his dark hair freshly trimmed and his weathered face transformed by a smile of such pure joy that it took Clara's breath away. When the minister pronounced them husband and wife, their kiss was witnessed by sunlight streaming through stained glass windows, painting them both in jeweled light. "Where will you go now?" Brennan asked during the modest reception that followed. Clara and Elias exchanged glances, a conversation passing between them that needed no words. They had discussed this question many times during the weeks following the trial, weighing options and possibilities with the careful consideration of people who had learned not to take their happiness for granted. "Back to the mountains," Elias said finally. "Back home." The journey to their hidden valley took on an entirely different character now that they traveled as husband and wife. They rode side by side through country that Clara was beginning to know as well as she had once known the streets of Millbrook. And every familiar landmark filled her with a sense of homecoming she had never expected to feel about such wild terrain. When they finally crested the ridge that looked down into their sanctuary, Clara felt tears spring to her eyes. The cabin sat exactly as they had left it, solid and welcoming in the afternoon sunshine. The garden plot showed new growth where seeds had volunteered from the previous year's harvest, and the stream ran clear and cold beside the home they had built together through that long winter of discovery. "No regrets?" Elias asked softly as they stood together looking down at the valley that would be their permanent home. "None," Clara replied, and meant it with every fiber of her being. They settled quickly back into the rhythms of mountain life, but now those rhythms included new dreams and possibilities. Within a month of their return, Clara had begun to put into practice an idea that had been growing in her mind since the trial. "There are children in these mountains," she told Elias one morning over breakfast. "Children whose families are too scattered and too poor to build a proper school. They deserve an education just as much as the children I taught in Millbrook." Elias looked up from his coffee, his gray eyes thoughtful. "What are you proposing?" "A traveling school. We could visit the homesteads and mining camps on a regular circuit, staying a week or two in each place to teach the children. All we'd need is books, slates, and the willingness to adapt our lessons to whatever space we can find." The idea took shape quickly once they committed to it. Elias built a sturdy wagon that could carry their teaching supplies and camping equipment, while Clara wrote letters to educators back east requesting donations of books and materials. The response was overwhelming. Teachers and school boards who had heard about the trial sent packages containing primers, arithmetic texts, geography books, and even a few precious volumes of literature. Their first circuit took them to 6 different settlements scattered throughout the mountain territory. At each stop, they were welcomed with enthusiasm that bordered on reverence. Parents who had despaired of their children ever receiving formal education watched with wonder as Clara transformed a mining camp's mess hall into a classroom or set up lessons beneath the pines outside a remote homestead. "You're teaching them to see beyond these mountains," observed Martha Henderson, a settler's wife whose 3 children had never seen a book before Clara's arrival. "My little Sarah talks about nothing but becoming a teacher herself someday. Education opens doors." Clara replied, watching as 8-year-old Sarah carefully practiced her letters on a precious piece of paper. "Even here in the wilderness, knowledge gives children choices they wouldn't have otherwise." Elias proved to be a natural assistant teacher, his practical skills complementing Clara's academic instruction perfectly. He taught the older boys carpentry and horsemanship, while Clara worked with the younger children on reading and arithmetic. In the evenings, they would hold classes for adults who had never learned to read, and Clara found immense satisfaction in watching grown men and women struggle through their first sentences with the same determination their children showed. As summer turned to autumn and then to winter, word of the traveling school spread throughout the territory. Families began timing their visits to settlements to coincide with the Boone circuit, and some remote homesteaders made special trips to ensure their children didn't miss the opportunity for education. "You're changing lives out here," Thomas Brennan wrote in a letter that reached them during their winter break. The territorial government is already talking about establishing official circuit schools based on your model. But for Clara, the greatest satisfaction came not from official recognition, but from the daily moments of discovery and growth she witnessed in her students. There was 10-year-old Johnny MacArthur, whose family had traveled 3 days through mountain passes just so he could learn to read. There was Rebecca Sullivan, a miner's daughter who showed such aptitude for mathematics that Clara began teaching her advanced concepts, usually reserved for much older students. "I want to be a teacher like you, Mrs. Boone," Rebecca announced one day during their spring visit to the Sullivan claim. Clara felt her heart swell with pride and purpose. "Then you must keep studying, even when I'm not here. Promise me you'll practice your letters and numbers every day." "I promise," Rebecca said solemnly, and Clara knew she meant it. The second year of their circuit brought new challenges and rewards. They expanded their route to include mining camps in the far reaches of the territory, places so remote that some residents hadn't seen outsiders in months. The welcome they received in these places was almost overwhelming. Families would plan celebrations around their arrival, and children would shyly approach with wildflowers and hand-carved gifts. It was during this second year that Clara began to notice changes in herself that went beyond the deep satisfaction she found in teaching. She was stronger now, both physically and emotionally, shaped by mountain life and the constant travel their work required. Her hands, once soft from indoor living, were now calloused from helping to set up camp and tend their horses. Her complexion had been burnished by sun and wind into a healthy glow that no amount of city living could have achieved. But it was the changes in Elias that moved her most deeply. The haunted look that had shadowed his eyes during those first months after leaving Millbrook had gradually faded, replaced by a contentment and sense of purpose that transformed him completely. He laughed more easily now, his smiles coming readily as he watched Clara work with their students or listened to their excited chatter around evening campfires. "You've given me back my life," he told her one evening as they sat together on their cabin porch, watching the sun set over the valley that had become their sanctuary. "Not just by helping clear my name, but by showing me that running away from the world isn't the only way to find peace." Clara leaned against his shoulder, feeling the solid warmth of him beneath her cheek. "We've given each other everything that matters," she said softly. The letter arrived on a crisp October morning during their third year in the mountains, brought by a territorial mail carrier who had ridden hard to reach them before winter closed the passes. Clara recognized the formal letterhead immediately. It was from the Colorado Territorial Board of Education. "What is it?" Elias asked, noting her expression as she read. "They want to offer me a position," Clara said, her voice filled with wonder. "Superintendent of Mountain Education for the entire territory. They're proposing to establish permanent schools in 6 different locations and want me to oversee the whole system." Elias was quiet for a long moment, studying her face. "It's what you always dreamed of, isn't it? A chance to build something lasting, something bigger than a single classroom." Clara folded the letter carefully, her mind racing with possibilities and implications. The position would mean respect, security, the chance to help hundreds of children throughout the territory. It would also mean leaving their hidden valley, taking up residence in Denver, becoming part of the very civilization they had chosen to leave behind. "It would change everything," she said finally. "Yes, it would." Elias took her hands in his gray eyes serious. "But change isn't always a bad thing. You've proven what's possible out here, Clara. Maybe it's time to share that knowledge with a larger audience." They talked long into the night, weighing the pros and cons of such a dramatic change. In the end, it was a visit from Rebecca Sullivan that helped Clara make her decision. The girl, now 14 and as bright as any student Clara had ever taught, hiked alone to their cabin to share news that her family was planning to move to Denver so she could attend a proper school. "I want to become a teacher like you, Mrs. Boone," Rebecca said, echoing the words she had spoken years earlier. "But I need more education than I can get here in the mountains." Looking at this remarkable young woman, strong, intelligent, hungry for knowledge. Clara realized that her work in the mountains had been preparation for something larger. She had proven that education could flourish even in the remotest places. But now it was time to build the infrastructure that would make such education permanently available to all children. "We'll take the position," she told Elias that evening. "But on one condition." "What's that?" "We keep the cabin. This valley will always be our true home, the place we return to when we need to remember who we are." Elias smiled and pulled her into his arms. "I wouldn't have it any other way." On their last evening in the valley before departing for Denver and their new life, Clara and Elias sat together on the porch where they had shared so many quiet moments. The familiar sounds of the mountains surrounded them, wind in the pines, the distant cry of a hawk, the musical babble of the stream that had witnessed their love story from its very beginning. Clara pulled the quilt they had sewn together during that first winter around both their shoulders. A patchwork of memories made from fabric scraps that told the story of their journey from strangers to lovers to partners in building something meaningful. "Do you ever think about that day in the schoolhouse?" she asked, watching the first stars appear in the darkening sky. "When you came to take me away from everything I thought I wanted?" "Every day," Elias replied, his arm tightening around her. "I think about how terrified you were, how brave you were, how you changed my life in ways I never could have imagined." "The children in Millbrook probably have a new teacher by now," Clara mused. "Someone who follows the prescribed curriculum and maintains proper discipline and never dreams of dragging her students into the kind of adventure we've built here. Do you miss it? The predictability of that life?" Clara considered the question seriously, looking back on the woman she had been, orderly, cautious, content with the safety of routine. That woman seemed like a stranger now, someone she had known long ago but had outgrown completely. "No," she said finally, "I don't miss it at all." That woman was living a half-life, afraid to take risks because she thought safety was the same thing as happiness. She turned in Elias's arms to face him fully, seeing in his weathered features the map of all they had endured and overcome together. "Sometimes the person who changes your life forever is the last person you expected to love," she said, echoing words he had written in his journal during that long-ago winter when they were still learning to trust each other. "And sometimes," Elias replied, pressing his lips to her forehead, "the greatest adventure begins the moment you stop running from your heart." Above them, the mountain sky blazed with stars that had witnessed the birth of their love and would continue to shine long after their story became legend. In the distance, the sound of children's laughter drifted on the wind, the next generation of mountain families, already dreaming of the education that Clara and Elias had proven was possible even in the remotest places. Their work here was complete, but their larger mission was just beginning. Tomorrow, they would ride toward Denver and a new chapter of their lives. But tonight, they were simply Clara and Elias Boone, sitting together in the place where they had learned that love and purpose could flourish even in the most unlikely circumstances. The mountains had given them everything they needed to build a life of meaning. Now it was time to share those gifts with the world.